Shift gears for a second. Let's bring it back closer to home. So Hurricane Helene devastated the area, devastated the Southeast. A lot of folks in Western North Carolina, parts of South Carolina, still picking up the pieces, still have a long road to recovery. And it was, as we were watching the storm come in real time, I mean, it was just, our jaws just dropped to the floor seeing the damage and what was happening there in Western North Carolina. And us as a station, we've done a lot to try to help support, along with other folks in the community. I say all this to say that recently, let me not say today, recently we got reports from NOAA about the damage and that Hurricane Helene caused. I want to bring in meteorologist, my good friend, meteorologist Brittany Van Voorhees. I knew I was going to make you smile, Brittany.
Yeah, you did. It was yesterday.
Yeah, it was yesterday. Okay, thank you for that clarification.
So they do this for every single storm. So
Gotcha.
you always get a tropical cyclone report. Of course, there's so many storms that happen, so this always comes out sometime in the early part of the spring. My guess also is that over the next few weeks, we're probably all going to get the retired names. So as you know, you've been in news for a while, so have I. Hurricane names repeat every 6 years, but they do retire them when they cause catastrophic damage, or a certain amount of billion-dollar damage, certain amount of deaths. And so I can say with 100% certainty, even though I don't work for the World Meteorological Organization, that that's going to be one that will be retired. So that means in 2030, there would be a new H name.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't even want to think that far.
Yeah, no, it's hard to think about. No, it is hard to think about. So tropical cyclone report came out, told us really what we already knew, living here, but the data, and I'm a data person, so being able to kind of see that in black and white versus color, with all the reports and things like that we get was interesting to go through all the data, but something that we already knew from living in North Carolina.
A lot of stuff that you already knew, but what stuck out for you in this report? Because I'm reading 248 fatalities. Again, I'm reading this in real time. And again, this storm was more than just Western North Carolina. It was across the Southeast. What stuck out to you, Brittany?
I would say what stuck out to me locally, but also, again, something that we kind of already knew, was the deaths. I think a lot of times people assume that when a hurricane makes landfall, there are hundreds of deaths that happen, and that is not the case. 248 deaths. That was actually the highest death total since Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in the contiguous United States. That's because, as we know, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, so they are United States citizens. And Hurricane Maria does take if we were to add non-contiguous, Hurricane Maria would take that spot because there was almost 2,000 deaths with that one. But I mean, 250 almost fatalities is a lot with a storm. But the thing is we don't live near the coast. Yeah. Which you always hear the conversation is, oh, well, if you're not near the coast, you can't be impacted, or you're not impacted as much. And we as meteorologists know that that's not the case. And I think, unfortunately, Helene was an example of the fact that that wasn't. We probably saw more deaths, or we definitely did if you look at the data, but we'll not get to that. But we saw more deaths here in North and South Carolina than Florida, where the storm made landfall. Oh, yes, you got that graphic up there. So 26 deaths in South Carolina and 85 in North Carolina. And that was direct deaths. So the way that NOAA classifies this is that indirect is freshwater flooding in Nick Sturtevant's backyard that potentially causes death versus a direct impact from the storm, if that makes sense. Yeah. Or sometimes an indirect death can be, actually this happened with Hurricane Matthew back in 2016. I was working in Myrtle Beach. An indirect death was some older people at a care facility lost their lives because they lost power. Yeah. And so things like the generator couldn't, do their sleep apnea machine, those kind of machines and things like that. So that's more indirect versus direct, but still substantial. And I think that that's the thing that a lot of kids actually ask me at school talks a lot. If in the state of North Carolina, you do weather during kindergarten, 2nd, 5th, and 7th grade. And so I do school talks all the time. And the same thing, it's just kind of assume that every single time a hurricane makes landfall, people die. And when it's not in their area, maybe it's something that people aren't as concerned about or aren't as worried about. But I think this just goes to show people that we can have impacts, well within the center. And when you compare it to Katrina, because that was such a well-known storm in 2005, which same thing, a lot of their deaths were from indirect impacts as well. A lot of their deaths were attributed to the levee collapsing and the additional freshwater flooding that they got later on.
I do want to ask, and we talk about this. I think we talked about this a couple of times as far as, each storm is its own. Like you
Each
try
storm
not,
is different, yeah.
Yeah, you try not to compare it, but in your entire career, when Helene hit and after it hit, I mean, for you, I mean, I'm sure that had to be eye-opening. I mean, for a lot of us, but talk about you specifically.
It was eye-opening. I think one of the most heartbreaking things that's ever happened in my career was being live on air with Brad, us in the Weather Center, seeing the message from the National Weather Service over in Western North Carolina about the fact that they expected the dam at Lake Lure to collapse. They were getting close to that. We know, thank goodness, it held. But the words coming out of your mouth almost seems like you're telling people that they're going to die. And so that was really heartbreaking for me, and it gives me chills actually just even talking about it right now, because there's a certain point in which a dam of that magnitude would have caused way more deaths. And so I would never want to say to someone's family who lost somebody or lost their home or something that it could have been worse, because when people say that, you know how it is. If you were one of the ones impacted, you're like, stop talking.
This was worse.
But it could,
Yeah,
but it
yeah.
really could have
Yeah.
been, because you look at Katrina kind of as that threshold. It essentially would have been a similar impact with all the water that came. It also was impactful, I think, too, because coming from Florida, as you mentioned, you can never compare a storm directly because every single storm is different. The angle of approach, what the season before caused, whether they're really wet because it's been wet or they're really dry. But when there's for example, I'll use this. Hurricane Ian, 2022.
Yeah.
18 feet of storm surge on Fort Myers Beach. If we had another storm that caused 18 feet of storm surge, you could say, hey, you guys, it's not going to be the same because there's so many things that can be different. But remember Ian, similar storm surge. Like, that's an easy way to kind of quantify two hurricanes for someone who lives there. But there's no comparison for Helene, because the last time that they saw flood of that magnitude was in 1906. So there's no one who was alive in 2024 that was alive during those storms. And even if they were, which they weren't, we know, but they would have been a baby, maybe, if someone has lived over 110 years. So there was nothing to compare it to, because meteorologists on TV, National Weather Service, NOAA, were saying for days, catastrophic, life-threatening.
Yeah.
And those are dramatic words. But almost every hurricane that makes landfall at a Category 4 can be catastrophic or life-threatening for wherever that's making landfall. And so people hear that, and it's not that they didn't, I would never want to blame people, because it's not that they didn't prepare, but how do you prepare for something that you don't know it can cause?
And one thing I want to point out, Brittany, when talking to folks in the mountains, they told me that's the reason why they moved to the mountains. You don't have to worry about hurricanes. We don't have to worry about this. I've been sent to the mountains for mudslides because that's, just the area, right? But they didn't, how do you prepare for this if you live in Western North Carolina?
I've had people ask me, tell me that they thought that it couldn't flood in the mountains.
Yeah.
Like in general, which is a misconception, because higher elevations can, I wouldn't say always flood worse, but can flood worse because of the elevation changes. Unfortunately, the way to prepare in this case specifically, because of the significant flooding, if there were to be another storm that was similar to Helene, you would have to evacuate.
Yeah.
And I just, in my career, which has been about 10 years, so nothing like what Brad, has seen over 25, or Larry over 40, but I've never seen such a large area of inland communities evacuated, because the reason why evacuation orders sometimes only happen, 24 hours in advance, 36 hours in advance, is because it is not only difficult to do, but they only evacuate the people who are most impacted.
Right.
So you think Florida, again, using that as an example, zone A or B, closest to the coast, most likely to flood because maybe they live on a river, whatever it is. They don't evacuate everybody who lives near the coast. So how do you tell inland Georgia, inland South Carolina, inland Florida, inland North Carolina, y'all got to leave? You can't.
Yeah.
I remember even trying to evacuate Matthew in 2016, and they reversed 95 to go both ways, and it was a nightmare. And so we have too many people who live in in this country and in the Southeast to be able to do all of that. I also think it is interesting too, because 1989 Hurricane Hugo is a lot of people's threshold for a hurricane to be impacted in Charlotte specifically. And while Charlotte did not have hurricane force winds with this storm, so Hugo still takes the cake for the only storm to have impacted Charlotte specifically with hurricane force winds. You look at some of the wind gusts in North Carolina, and it was Mount Mitchell, Frying Pan Mountain, a wind gust of 63 miles an hour, which is close to Category 1 hurricane force, 101 miles per hour in Banner Elk, North Carolina.
Wow.
Now, they get gusty winds, but not from a hurricane. So we have reliable weather data, or more reliable weather data, since about 1900, but the satellite era only started in 1960. So we don't even have that much time realistically to quantify for people who have lived through these storms what it could be. So kids will ask me all the time about the most impactful storm, and I always think back to 1900, the Galveston, Texas hurricane, because it's essentially back then you woke up and boom, a hurricane's on your doorstep, and it caused tens of thousands of deaths. But I mean, 248 is still a lot.
I do want to ask, because I worked in this area, Nash County. I know it's on the list when it's talking about tornadoes. 33 tornadoes?
Yeah.
That this storm produced? Wow. I mean, that's not really a question, Brittany, but it just kind of reading through a lot of this stuff, like 2,700 people rescued from high water across the southeast. I mean, my God. This was just, you look back and it's just, I remember, earlier before this show, I was clipping some of the video and going through some of the Helene damage, and I just couldn't believe it. I keep saying that, but it's hard to fathom.
It really is. Busick, North Carolina, which is in Yancey County, almost 31 inches from the storm. That is more than a lot of cities, towns, even sometimes in some states get in a whole year.
Yeah.
So you hear the term year's worth of rainfall, and again, I think sometimes it just kind of goes over people's head. I don't know. We all have things that we're worried about every single day. Friends, family, whatever you have going on. But I think we just have to remember that just because it didn't happen to you doesn't mean that we can't take the lessons learned and things like that to try to make things better.
Right.
I think that's a really important thing too, because I can promise you that people near the coast want us to be worried about them. When a storm is making landfall, like Hurricane Florence, back in 2018. So we also just have to be, I think, more aware of what can happen, but also kind of adjust maybe the way that we're communicating. And again, I still think it is very hard to quantify for people catastrophic rainfall, catastrophic landfalling hurricane when you're talking about the mountains of North Carolina. But hopefully there are things that we can do and kind of get better from with the storm. I also just think it's just interesting in general when you look at the numbers to look at the fact that Florida essentially had the least impacts. And that's where the storm made landfall.
Yeah.
And it was actually, I think sometimes it gets lost that it was the strongest storm to hit the Big Bend of Florida since about 1900. So in almost 120 years. So it was still a significant storm for the state of Florida. Yeah. But because the impacts were so much worse in other places, I think that's why, I don't know, maybe some of that messaging got lost a little bit, because you don't want to say only, but only 3 tornadoes happened in Florida, but 21 in South Carolina. So
yeah, that's eye-opening. Brittany Van Voorhees, meteorologist Brittany Van Voorhees, thank you so much for breaking down this report. Again, this is a long report, a lot of numbers for us that covering it on air as it was happening. Eye-opening. Thank you for your time, and you'll be updating us throughout the shows, Brittany? I'm asking a question mark. I should end that with a question mark.
You're saying throughout the shows later on today?
Yeah, throughout the day.
Not about this specifically.
Okay.
I'm working on a different story, but we will certainly update you in the next, in the 6 months between June 1st and November 30th. And hoping, praying, whatever you do to put good vibes out in the world, to never have another Helene in North Carolina.
And Mom.